Hey everyone, this is Drafting the Past host Kate Carpenter. Before we get to today's interview, I have a big favor to ask. Will you fill out a survey about the podcast to help me figure out what is and isn't working for you about the show? You can go to draftingthepast.com/survey and answer a few questions. Your responses will be a huge help to me in making the show as helpful to you as possible. Again, that's draftingthepast.com/survey. All right, thanks in advance for your help. On with the show. Welcome back to Drafting the Past. This is a podcast all about the craft of history, and I'm your host, Kate Carpenter. In each episode, I'm joined by a historian to take a deep dive into how they do the research and writing that goes into their history books. Today, I'm happy to welcome historian of religion, Dr. Matthew Avery Sutton.
Thanks, Kate. It's great to be here.
Matthew's newest book is called Chosen Land: How Christianity Made America and Americans Remade Christianity. It follows the relationship between Christianity and the nation from the arrival of the first Europeans up to Donald Trump's second term in office. Matt is the author of 3 previous books, along with an edited collection and a documentary history, and he regularly writes about the history of Christianity in America for a general audience. We talked about how he thinks about all those different audiences and how he keeps writing so much despite many personal and professional responsibilities. He has been the department chair for 7 years. Here's my conversation with Dr. Matthew Avery Sutton.
You know, like a lot of PhDs in history, I wasn't really conscious of what it meant to be a writer when I was in grad school. I was thinking more about how do I finish this dissertation and how do I get it by my committee members. And so the plan initially was just that. And I think, though, there were a few things going on with me. Is I've never thought I was the smartest guy in the room. And so I've never had a real expansive, sexy vocabulary that just, stuns everybody with the power of my words. And so to compensate for that, I focused on being clear and forthright and trying to write in a way that was accessible. And so when I was working on my dissertation, I was doing that. And so, I spent, like all grad students do, a lot of time thinking about theory, studying theory, but I wanted to be really careful not to incorporate jargon into it. And I should say that the dissertation was on Amy Semple McPherson, a revivalist in Los Angeles in the 1920s and 30s, this really charismatic individual. So I was writing the dissertation, and I found out at the time that PBS was just beginning development of a new episode for their American Experience series focused on Amy Semple McPherson. And so through some mutual friends, I got in touch with the producer there. And in the end, they ended up deciding to use my book as the basis for the show. And so as I was finishing the dissertation and then converting it into a book, I was also simultaneously working with somebody who was a screenwriter working on this documentary. And so she helped me really think, too, about narrative power, about style, about how to entice an audience. And so there were a lot of changes that I made in writing that first book that helped me kind of think about the process and what it means to reach a larger audience than just your dissertation.
Wow, that seems like a real gift in your first book.
Yeah, it absolutely was. And then it was it was dumb luck. So the documentary came out. I was on Morning Edition on NPR that day, the Tuesday the book released. And then the very first review was by John Updike. It was, the full 4-page review in the New Yorker, which is not exactly what every grad student expects to have happen to their dissertation. And Updike hated it. And it turns out Updike was extraordinarily critical of biographies. His review of my book was used later by a literary critic assessing Updike's own career in the way that Updike was apparently pretty gracious, except when it came to biographies. And so my book was one of the many, many biographies he trashed. But nevertheless, what it did was it made me think even more clearly about writing for a general audience and helped me recognize that as historians, we can talk to everyday people. And so ever since then, I've really thought about my parents as my target audience. My dad has a BA. My mom doesn't have a college degree. That I want to make sure if they don't understand what I'm writing, then I'm doing something wrong. And so that's kind of the goal and what I try to do.
When and where do you like to do your writing?
So I'm pretty methodical. I have a home office. So I love working at home. It's quiet. I have a 17-year-old and a 20-year-old. And so the 17-year-old is very busy and the 20-year-old is away at college and my wife works full time. And so, the dream scenario is working at home every day with the cat doing what I want to do. The reality is actually very different. I'm in my 7th year as department chair. And so the expectation is pretty much that I'm at the office every day. And so I end up doing most of my writing in my office here at WSU. I try to stay home on Fridays to write. That doesn't always work out if administrators generate meetings for me on my calendar, and they can just do that. They can just grab a time without asking. There's no setting up meetings. If I have time, they'll take it. But the ideal world is to work at home in my quiet office. But the reality for the last 7 years has been in my office with my door open, with faculty coming in and out at all times.
I was going to ask this question a little bit later, but I'm struck by it now, which is that you're fairly prolific, and yet you obviously have a lot going on, including department chair, which I have always heard from people is a lot. So how do you keep your writing moving forward, even with all those distractions?
This is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about because I'm 50 years old, and I am aware that I have published probably more than the average professor at this stage in their career. And for me, there's been a few things. One, I've always seen writing as a job, and it's a job I love, but it is a job. So I don't wait for inspiration. I don't believe in a muse. It's not a matter of waiting until I kind of feel like I've got something to say. For me, my process has been spending lots of time in the archives, finding and locating primary sources. So in the olden days, it was actually like printing them in the archives. And then the next stage was scanning them with a phone. And now I can do a lot of stuff that's available online that has already been scanned for me. But for me, it's always been stacks and stacks and stacks of research material, either physical stacks or virtual stacks. And then I'll go through those documents and highlight what I think is important, highlight quotes that I think are telling, are fun or interesting, or kind of help provide insight into whatever larger issues I'm looking at. And so for me, when I'm working, I can be dealing with, bureaucratic nonsense emails that come in as department chair, answer that email, then immediately turn and pivot to whatever that stack is, wherever I am in the primary sources, and start writing up those primary sources. And the way I do it is I'll copy the quote, copy and paste the quote into a document. I'll write some context around it to just make sure I understand like what that quote is about and why I think it matters and why it struck me as important. And so my first drafts will often be a very long string of these kind of loosely connected primary source driven ideas. But that process means I don't have to be really deeply invested into the writing in a way that keeps me from, dealing with other distractions. And so I can just pivot back and forth and back and forth. And one habit I have developed is leaving my email open all the time. And so I'll be sitting writing and then immediately get a notification when an email comes in. And I will often deal with emails right away. And I've grown to hate that. I dream of the day when I'm not chair and I'm going to turn off my email and I'm going to start, spending some time not worried about kind of all of the many different kinds of demands so that I can really get into the writing groove. But for now, it really is multitasking.
What happens once you have that first draft of sort of connected primary sources? What do you do from there?
Yes, so it's always too long. That's one of the downsides. The second downside is it means I'll have three sources saying the absolute same thing, and an editor will be like, we don't need three people telling us the same thing. And so my writing process is very rough in the first drafts with extensive rewriting. And so I think other folks who, at least as I've talked to folks, people who are better at setting aside, 4 or 5 hours to just write and focus just on that, they probably do much better first drafts than I do. And so my first drafts are just an absolute mess. And like I said, it's just strung together series of, paragraphs, kind of incoherent. And so for me, the real writing is the rewriting. And so it's many drafts and then cutting. It's always been painful for me to cut in a way that feels absolute. And so I always have all these files of all the stuff I cut. And so it's there. Nobody will ever see it again. It's just taking up space on my computer. But it is a little easier for me to part with it when I know it's still there somewhere. So that becomes part of my process. And it also, you can see it in my writing if you read my stuff, that it is very quote heavy. And I try not to show that as directly by the time it gets to the final draft. I'm hoping that there's not more than one or two good quotes per paragraph. But, you will not read much of my work and not see quotes in just about every single paragraph. It's going to be driven by those sources.
Are there people that you turn to for feedback while you're working on those drafts?
I look for different kinds of feedback from different kinds of folks. We can talk, I suspect we'll probably want to talk in a minute about the professional side of like editors and the folks who work for publishing companies. But in terms of early drafts, it's finding friends, colleagues who I know are going to be really critical and sometimes really mean. I had a mentor and an advisor who did not pull her punches. She was very old school and how she was trained. She was trained in the 60s. And I've always believed, she focused on women's history. This is Jane DeHart, who's written a wonderful biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But Jane was trained really before the second wave of feminism had really impacted higher education. And so she had to fight so hard to survive and then ultimately to succeed and launch a career as a woman. And so I think what that did for her was create in her a sense of absolute professionalism and extraordinarily high standards that she then held her students to. She was always my first reader through most of my career, and I could always count on her for really rigorous feedback. Another longtime mentor has been Grant Wacker, another historian of American religion. He's a beautiful writer. He's also very smart, but I love having his influence on my early drafts and helping me think about things that I'm not thinking about in the ways that maybe I should. He tends to be a little more conservative than I am in terms of his approach to religion. He's still very much a true believer in the religious traditions that he writes about. And so sometimes if I'm being too harsh, if I'm being too critical, he'll push me on that. We often don't agree in the end anyway, but it's great to get his perspective. And then on the other side is David Hollinger, the veteran intellectual historian, who's extraordinarily cynical and skeptical of religion. And so I sort of feel like he and Grant are the two devils, the devil and the angel on each side of my ear, the old cartoons. That, Grant is telling me to be nicer to my subjects. David is telling me to be more critical of my subjects. So I have these mentors who are, have spent their entire careers. Actually, all three of them are now retired in the profession. And then I have my peer colleagues. And among those, I have friends who are just really smart. And so I've found people over the years that will, when you give them a manuscript, they'll actually read it carefully. And I try and return the favor. Like, I realize that's a huge ask. And so I try and always be generous with my time when they need help. And then I'll find people who are specialists in areas that I know I'm weaker. So for this last book, Indigenous history is so difficult to do. And it's especially difficult for somebody who's just not been trained in Indigenous history. So I have a colleague and a friend who's an extraordinarily skilled historian and also a member of the Upper Skagit tribe. And so it was really important for me to have him read how I dealt with tribal issues and tribal history and be able to assess that and evaluate that. In this latest book, I also spent a lot of time in colonial and early republic in 19th century history, which I hadn't really dealt with since graduate school. And so for each chunk of the book, I had different readers who were specialists in those areas and asked them to read it and so that they could push me and really, they saved me from all kinds of errors, but also helped me think more broadly about what I was trying to do.
As you've kind of touched on with asking other people sort of who specialize in different areas, Chosen Land, your new book, is just a massive project. How do you come to a project like this? How do you decide, yes, this is what I'm going to do?
Yeah, so Chosen Land, 650 pages, just came out. Thinking back over my career, the primary issue that I have been obsessed with, or that I've tried to explain, if you kind of think about every book, everything I've published, articles, newspaper pieces, op-eds, etc., it's always trying to explain the role of religion in the broader American culture and why it matters outside of just religion. So it's why religion's affecting politics and public policy and foreign policy and education and economics and pop culture, debates over gender, sexuality, race, on and on and on. And so that's what I'm always trying to do. And as I've done that, one of the issues that I have realized is that Americans are more religious. We have a higher religious adherence than most of our peer nations, that secularization just has not been as successful in the US as in Canada or in the UK or in Germany or in France. And I wanted to explain that. So I've done pieces of that. I've done, subsections of it through previous books, but I'd never kind of swung for the fences, taken on the massive project of how do we tell this story from beginning to end to get to the point where, today, any major politician running for office has to explain their religious faith. And they essentially have to conform to mainstream religious ideology, mainstream religious ideas. And so I wanted to trace the long history of how that came to be. And so the colonial era sets up the First Amendment. The First Amendment then sets up what happens after, which then becomes the core of the book. And so The book was in part this effort to kind of answer this bigger question, to synthesize a lot of material. And honestly, it was also pitched to me by an editor. The editor I'd worked with on my Double Cross book, Dan Gersel, whose father is a professional historian, Gary Gersel. Dan said, we don't really have a major book on American Christianity. Why don't you write one? And initially, I didn't like the idea. That seemed boring to me. But the more I got into it, the more excited I got. And in the end, I'm really happy I did it.
I want to ask just a, a super practical question. My current project is 4 decades, one small region, and I still have a hard time like wrapping my head around all the pieces and keeping track of it all. You have undertaken a huge topic, a huge timeline. Walk me through sort of the steps of putting that together. How do you get all those moving pieces corralled?
Double Crossed published in 2019, and I was just starting on this book as we were, finalizing Double Cross, just doing the last pieces. So I always think about what's next as I'm finishing up a project. This was something I was trained to do by my mentor, and also again because I like it, I'm always excited to start jumping into the next thing. And so I'd started Chosen Land 2019. Double Cross came out in I think October of 2019. So I was just beginning, and then of course we hit March and COVID hits. And so, like everybody else, I was confined to my home, to my office, my home office, actually. And the benefit of the digital revolution was that so much material that is outside of copyright, so really outside of the 20th century, has been digitized that I just didn't even realize because it wasn't relevant to my previous projects, which were almost all focused on the 20th century. And so I could sit at home during COVID and read every pamphlet or tract or, book of sermons or political manifesto that was written in the 18th and the 19th centuries through the Hathi Trust or through Internet Archive or, online university libraries. And so I ended up essentially just starting at the beginning, just starting chronologically and, doing the same process we talked about, but I tried to identify what would be the most important sources. For a project this big, of course, I had to reread the secondary literature reread the stuff I hadn't read since grad school and then catch up on all the new stuff that had been published in the last 20 years since grad school is getting further and further away. And so it was a combination of both familiarizing myself with the trends in the fields and the separate eras, and then diving back into those primary sources. And this gets back to your question about productivity. One flaw to my process is I'm not patient enough and I don't spend as much time in the historiography as I should. And I'm always aware that there are people who I'm not citing that because I just didn't know about their book. And I'm always feel bad about that. I'm always embarrassed when I realize later that, oh my gosh, here was this really important monumental book and I just didn't realize it was there. And so that really is a problem, that I'm not as patient as I should be when it comes to staying current on literature. Obviously, I do stay somewhat current, but just not as current as I should or could.
There are a lot of books out there.
There are, yes.
Take the exit. Turn right into the drive-thru.
Nope, I'm making dinner tonight.
You don't have time. Josh has practice.
Oh, that's right. I'll just get a salad.
And fries?
No, just the salad.
But salad cancels fries.
Salad only.
Fries.
Salad.
Fries.
Food noise isn't fair, but Mochi Health is. The affordable GLP-1 source that puts you on the road to successful weight loss.
Hey, can I get the...
Fries.
Salad. Sorry.
Learn more at joinmochi.com. Mochi members have access to licensed physicians and nutritionists. Results may vary.
To dig into his writing a little more closely, I asked Matt to read an excerpt from his newest book. Here's Dr. Matthew Avery Sutton reading from Chosen Land, How Christianity Made America and Americans Remade Christianity.
Chapter 20, Making the World Safe for Democracy. Presbyterian revivalist Billy Sunday loved to preach both Armageddon and Americanism. He had gained fame in the 1880s as a gutsy base runner for the Chicago White Stockings. But when he converted to Christianity, he abandoned the ballpark for the revival tent. He would no longer be stealing bases from other teams, but souls from the devil. By the early 20th century, Sunday's revivals filled the largest auditoriums in the country's greatest cities. In part, his success, like that of most revivalists in American history, derived from his populist style. Like his predecessor, Dwight Moody, he had little formal education. He was a common guy, a man of the people. He described himself as proud to be from the corn rows of Iowa. The malodors of the barnyard are on my feet, he boasted. I've greased my hair with goose grease. I have blackened my shoes with the cob. I've wiped my proboscis with the gunny sack. I've drunk coffee out of my saucer, and I've eaten peas with a knife. I'm a graduate from the University of Poverty and Hard Knocks. The Atlanta Constitution praised the evangelist form. He preached to his audience, the Atlanta Constitution wrote, in the vernacular. He exhorts them in the style of vigorous directness common to the baseball diamond and the street. He translates the Bible into the slang of the day and paraphrases the sacred text with a freedom that is startling in its realism. Sunday's populist impulses inspired some revivalists to better connect with the public, while they embarrassed others as uncouth. As Christians debated their obligations to the state during World War I, Sunday rallied hundreds of thousands of Americans behind the military. If you turned hell upside down, Sunday famously preached, I bet you'd find Made in Germany stamped on the bottom of it. He promised that the United States would, quote, back the old Kaiser off the map. According to a New York Times reporter, he concluded a Manhattan revival service by leaping up on top of his pulpit and, quote, wildly waving a flag with both hands while every soul in the audience was on his feet cheering. During his wartime sermons, Sunday often went off on a tangent to, quote, flay Kaiser Bill and his dirty bunch of pretzel-chewing, Limburger-eating highbinders. When invited to give a benediction before the U.S. Congress, Sunday concluded, quote, we pray thee that thou wilt bear thy mighty arm and strike that great pack of hungry, wolfish Huns, whose fingers drip with blood and gore. Congressmen broke decorum by responding to that prayer with yells, cheers, and clapping.
You know, most of your chapters start with a memorable character or a scene. This one is particularly memorable, but they all set the stage for the chapter's focus, and you choose them really well. I was struck that, you know, it's not a secret that historians like to start with like an anecdote, but sometimes it feels like just a gesture and then they get on to the real meat. Whereas these are all very good. I mean, if you could have made up characters who perfectly fit each chapter's theme, they wouldn't have been better. How did you choose those moments?
I do love anecdotes, and I do think they're great literary tools for setting up a chapter. For me, it varied, and because the book is 20-something chapters, high 20s, I had to come up with a lot of them. And so I tried to balance sort of classic stories, like this Billy Sunday story. Any historian of American religion would know. Like Billy Sunday was one of the most famous revivalists of the era. His role in World War I is pretty well known. I still wanted to use it, though, because I was thinking about my audience as not just specialists in American religion, people who might not know who Billy Sunday is, probably don't know. And because he's such a colorful character that it would be a good way to open up this question of what is the relationship between religion and war that was going to be central to the chapter on World War I, and to illustrate the complexity of this question of patriotism and nationalism and Christian faith. I also, in other chapters, though, I purposely tried to find stories that were not going to be familiar, that were, derived from truly original research, things that I had uncovered in the archives, things that maybe people weren't familiar with. And so that became another focus. And then at one point, an editor had told me that the opening anecdotes should not be formulaic, like they shouldn't all be predictable, that you're going to bore a reader if every time they start a new chapter, it's going to be the same, like, here's the person, here's what they do, in exactly 2.5 pages, and then you move on. And so I varied the length. So I think some of them go as long as 4, maybe 5 pages. Some of them will just be 1 page. I also shifted between individuals like Billy Sunday, a policy issue like the development of the ratings code for Hollywood films was the opening for another chapter, to also the rise of particular groups. And so the idea was that readers, I always wanted to keep readers guessing, so they wouldn't know what the next chapter was going to do, that even though behind the scenes, the structure is, yes, anecdote makes a point to illustrate the larger issue of the chapter, they wouldn't know quite as they were reading that anecdote what it was. And the other thing, of course, I try to do is draw readers into the story that way to make it as compelling as possible. So I work really hard at never using passive verbs. There's probably some in the book, but I go through and do everything I can to have active verbs and to find the most kind of funny, illuminating quotes, entertaining quotes possible. And so again, me having to read Billy Sunday's words, I walked all over those. I butchered them, but they're, if you're reading them on paper, they're pretty funny. And his kind of sarcasm and his insults and his jabs are all entertaining. And that's intentional. That anytime I can find an outrageous quote by one of my characters, then I'm going to make sure and use it.
I mean, you've touched on a lot of ways that you make sure that this book is really easy to read, clear language, that you think about people like your parents when you were writing, that you go for active verbs, clear and funny examples. You also have really short chapters, which I always appreciate in books. Were there other ways that you tried to think about, despite being 600 pages, making this a book that actually reads at a really fast pace?
I did, and that exactly is it. And part of it is that pain of trimming, cutting. I have always in my career, unlike a lot of my friends and colleagues, I've been pretty good at hitting word counts. Like when you do a contract and the editor says this many words. This, though, is my epic fail. I decided if I was going to fail, I was going to fail big. So I think the contract here was 150,000 words. The final book is just over 200,000. At one point, it was 250,000 words. And my editor just said, I'm not going to read that. You have to get it down to 200 before I'll even look at it. And so I made that painful choice. And part of what I did in doing that was I built an Excel spreadsheet with a word count for every chapter so I could see which chapters were were longer than the other ones on a relative scale. And that was where I started my cuts, was to really just think about, I knew each chapter had a distinctive point that I felt like was essential to the book. Like I wasn't going to be able to cut chapters without leaving gaps, but I realized I could cut the length of those chapters. And then to your larger question, certainly I just feel like shorter chapters are always more readable. They're just easier. You keep your audience longer, keep your readers more engaged. I feel like that just even dates back to my own experience as a grad student. When you're reading a 50-page chapter, it's just painful. It's just hard. And even though it's just psychological, like what's the difference between one 50-page chapter and 3 15, 16-page chapters? It's the same number of words, but for some reason, 3 16-page chapters feels easier than one 50-page chapter. I should also say that I always think of this as 4 real books plus 1 edited collection plus 1 document reader. I don't think I've ever published a block quote. I'm very religiously opposed to block quotes, and I apologize to listeners who like block quotes. But I was told early in my career, and I think this is true, that often people just read right over them. They don't actually read a block quote. They see that as a license to move on. And so I will still have long quotes, but I will break them up and just have those little transitional words, she continued or whatever, to essentially make it 2 quotes instead of 1 quote to avoid it being a block quote, just because I'm afraid if it's a block quote, it's not going to get read.
This is like the question, maybe for historians generally, but especially for a book like this. But how do you decide what to keep in and leave out? I mean, you can't, despite length, you can't tell everything. So what hits the cutting room floor, what stays in, and what's kind of the guiding principle in your decisions?
So for this book, I was focused really on issues of power. And that's what I think sets me apart from some folks in the discipline of religious studies. I did a lot of cross-training. My PhD's history, but I did a lot of work at UC Santa Barbara in religious studies when I was a grad student. They have an excellent religious studies program. And this is going to be a huge reductionistic stereotype, but the religious studies folks tend to focus on like diversity of religion without paying a lot of attention to hierarchy and power, in the sense that like they will find real importance in a very small movement because it might illustrate broader things that we need to understand about how religion functions in the world. I am more interested in those who have power and exercise it and how they deploy religion as a way to do that. And so for this book, and I try to be clear about this in the introduction, it's not about every Christian movement in North America from colonial till now. It's about those who exercise the most power. So it's predominantly a white Protestant story. But to make the white Protestant power make sense, we have to have the perspectives of those who are outside of power. So there are always those pushing back, the indigenous communities, the enslaved communities. When I get to the 1960s and 70s, gay rights activists who are pushing for equality within American religious institutions. And so I try to be very explicit that I can't cover everybody, but I'm going to focus on those who have the greatest influence and the greatest role in our public life, because that's what the focus of the book was. But again, the caveat to that is those who have a lot less power help explain those who have power, and so they're in there too.
I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit more about what the editorial process was like for this book. You mentioned earlier that your editor helped to even sort of suggest you bring it into being. So what was that relationship like?
So as I mentioned, the first book was with Harvard, the book on Amy Semple McPherson. My second book, I stayed with Harvard because I recognized that some academics look down on commercial presses, that they don't treat them real seriously. And so I figured until I was promoted to full and had really established my career as more than just, my first book, that it was important to stay with the university press. But at that point, I hired an agent. And so I've also, like all of this, I don't think we can really separate from the role that an agent plays in this. But after my second book, I realized I probably wanted to move in a more commercial direction because I felt like commercial books would market the product better, would market the book better, and probably allow me to reach a larger audience and help me just grow readership. And so I looked at a few presses, ended up going with Basic for Double Crossed. And Basic is really good because they focus on intellectually driven books that make serious arguments, but that can reach a crossover audience. So if you look at their list, it's often professional historians or journalists or scientists who are writing, broader work for a general audience. And so they really straddle both worlds of academic, but also public popular. My editor there now, Brian Disselberg, is a PhD in history from Yale. They have a great tradition of working with historians and of taking the historical process very, very seriously. So I did Double Cross with them, was happy with that, did Chosen Land with them, was thrilled with it. And this is where, to get to your question, the editorial process, I've been extraordinarily impressed. So the book went into Brian, and he helped think about the big ideas. And so he sent me really substantial feedback about, you need to expand here, you need to cut here. These are the important themes. You need to double down on these. This is not as important or not as clear. Kind of just big picture, careful reading of the whole thing. So then I made that set of edits. Then it went back. They have another person who's a freelancer who worked for many, many years at, I think it was Random House, one of the other major commercial presses. And he was the line editor, which was not for dealing with like grammar, but really just dealing with clarity. So like this paragraph could be clearer. This seems inconsistent. You talk about this in this paragraph, but this thing in this 3 paragraphs later would make more sense if we moved it around. And so it was really focused on the writing more than the content, but in a big picture, structural kind of way. And he also, the great thing about having a senior editor was he also found some factual mistakes, and he also was able to give me, more substantive feedback on that. Then from there, it went to a third person who was the copy editor, who essentially was doing the grammar. So then we got into the very nitpicky nuance of making sure tenses match, making sure subject predicate matches, all of that kind of stuff. Then I had to respond to that. And then there was a production editor who compared my responses to the copy editor. So that was the fourth person who had to look at the entire manuscript. Production editor then cleaned up any discrepancies between me and the copy editor. And then it went to a fifth person, the final proofreader, who went through to make sure all those changes were done. And I don't know how many other presses give a manuscript of 200,000 words to 5 different professionals to read it at that level, but I've been so thrilled with the kind of care and time and effort that they put into it. And so, it's only been out for 2 weeks. No doubt I'm going to get emails about typos and factual errors and all the mistakes that still slip through that are entirely my fault. But it was really great having so much professional help, and it really is a statement to the value of a press like Basic.
I'm thinking back to our conversation about your schedule and the life of a department chair and full-time professor and writer. How do you think about fitting in marketing and publicity for your books in the midst of all of that?
Great question. So in 2019, when Double Cross came out, podcasts were just taking off. And I said no to a bunch. In retrospect, I really regret it. I mean, I just thought, what the heck? Like, what? I had done Morning Edition in 2007. I thought, if it's not Terry Gross, why am I doing this? And I've never been on Terry Gross. But obviously, since 2019, I've realized that no, podcasts are really important ways to talk about your work and to reach new audiences and to engage with different groups of people who otherwise might not encounter your stuff. And I love your podcast. I love talking about writing because I actually spend a lot of time thinking about it and have spent a lot of time thinking about it. And so it's fun to be able to reflect on it. So that part of it was that. The other part of it is I'm Gen X. And so I'm a little older than the social media revolution. Like I was I saw it. I was part of it. I was never on Facebook for a variety of reasons, even though Gen X is obviously very the Facebook generation. I was on Twitter back when Twitter was good, and I found Twitter extremely useful. But then when things went crazy with Elon Musk and Dodge, I canceled it. I had never been on Instagram. I moved over to Blue Sky. And then as I was getting closer to pub date for this book, I realized I've got to get back on social media. So I turned my X account back on, got on Instagram, still not on Facebook, still on Blue Sky, on Threads. But frankly, I'm now turning into the old man who doesn't know how to do social media. So like to repost something on Instagram, which I don't think is even what you call it on Instagram, like I had to talk to the media expert at Basic Books and be like, this person put this thing out. How the heck do I get my followers to see it? So it's been clunky. It's not been very good. And so I'm also trying to figure out that balance of wanting to make sure people are aware of my work, but without that kind of obnoxious self-promotion. And it probably is already obnoxious self-promotion. But, when I put something out there and my wife's aunt is the first person to tell me how proud she is of me, it's very sweet, but also kind of embarrassing because I'm trying to put this out for academic professional purposes, not for Auntie Karen to tell me how proud she is of me, even though it's so sweet that she does that.
I want to ask you too, because you write for lots of different audiences, whether it's students or op-eds. How do you think about the differences between writing a book and writing in those kinds of ways?
That's an important question. It's one I spend a lot of time thinking about, especially working in a public university where I have to be aware of the many different audiences and the fact that my salary is paid by the taxpayers of the state of Washington. So I feel like I have 4 different voices. I feel like my classroom voice with students is the one that I try to be most neutral. And of course, none of us can be neutral, none of us can be objective, but I certainly go into the classroom encouraging students to read primary sources and to tell me what they think. And then I feel like my job is to just push back on driving them to think about their own preconceived ideas, their own, ideological commitments, their own beliefs. And so the idea really is for me to help them think for themselves, not for me to tell them what to think. Then there's the audience of academics. So when I write a journal article, it very much is not something that I imagine somebody is going to take down to the beach to read for fun during the summer, unless they're a very strange person like me. I guess I could see doing that. But that's going to be focused on, historiography. I still try to avoid jargon, but it's going to be very didactic. Here are my arguments. Here's the significance of those arguments. Here's the roadmap I'm going to use to support that argument. And that's it. It's not going to be sexy, or I'm not going to worry about my metaphors or about painting word pictures. Then there's the books. In the genre of writing a crossover book that's still academically serious, but also reaches a larger audience, that's where I really think about still talking about an important historical argument, but trying to embed it in a narrative that's lively and engaging. And so more and more of my voice comes through on that. And I found with each book, too, I'm also more comfortable bringing in more and more of my own voice and my own opinions. And so, there are moments in each of my books, and I think even more so in Chosen Land, where you can really see me step out of the kind of aspiring neutral objective historian to know this is Matt Sutton and this is what he likes and doesn't like, or who he likes and doesn't like. It basically, because I work on religion, who is the fraud, who is the con man, who is the huckster, who is just disreputable. And then finally the op-ed. And when I've written op-eds, I feel like those are exaggerated versions of my voice, that to write a compelling op-ed, you really have to be argumentative. You really have to be controversial. And I don't mean Donald Trump on Truth Social trying to trigger people, but I mean, you need to make an unapologetic argument. In 800 words, you don't have space for nuance. You don't have space for a lot of qualifications to kind of contextualize. And so for those, I essentially go for the jugular. They're short, they're biting. And the idea is that I'm going to make a clear point. You have to get to the point immediately. Like no editor will take seriously an op-ed if you don't know 2 or 3 sentences in what the takeaway is going to be. And so in some ways, though, when I look back on them, I'm a little bit embarrassed because I know a historian can read it and say, well, wait a minute, there's all these, complicating factors that you didn't deal with there. And they're 100% right. There are. But you just can't worry about that in an 800-page op-ed. So for me, it's thinking about the different kinds of writing I do, whether it's a journal article or a book or an op-ed, and they're all very different.
Is it hard to get? I'm thinking about how an actor sort of has to get into character. Is it challenging to switch between voices?
I guess not for me because I've always liked the kind of argumentative style, so I find that fun. Again, sometimes I regret it a little bit. I'm sure you know that for famous people, obituaries are often written ahead of time, and then they're published when somebody dies. I had written one for Billy Graham that was a little mean spirited. The title was Billy Graham was on the wrong side of history, and the Guardian had accepted it before he died, and then it was one of the very first publications to hit right after news of his death came out. And so then I kind of felt a little bit guilty because it was like, do I really need to be trashing this guy on the day of his death? Because when I was writing it, he was very much alive and I was annoyed by his politics. So there are those kinds of things. But in general, it's not hard for me to do. I just don't want to be an asshole. And sometimes I realize I come off as an asshole in the op-ed voice. And so that's the thing I have to just live with and accept.
Well, I want to ask a little bit about your influences. What's the most influential writing advice you've ever gotten?
Boy, I think it's probably just bits and pieces here and there that I've picked up over the years. In grad school at Santa Barbara, one of my dissertation committee members was Elliot Brownlee, who was an economic historian or is an economic historian, writes about, intriguing tax policy. Couldn't come up with a funner topic than that. But he taught one of my graduate seminars, one of the research writing seminars, and he had like a list of rules. And that's where I first began to think about passive voice and not using passive voice. He really drilled that into us. I mentioned Grant Wacker earlier, one of my early mentors. His big book on Pentecostalism came out in 2003 while I was wrapping up my dissertation. It is a beautifully written book. And he too has these really fabulous metaphors and similes. And it made me realize the importance of kind of painting a picture for your readers of the stories you're trying to tell. And so I've always modeled my work on his. I've read Stephen King's book on writing a couple of times, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about his talking about writing. He's made me try to cleanse most of my books of adverbs. He hates them, and I've tried to not use them. The bad news with that, though, is Stephen King is just a master at metaphors. Like you can't read a paragraph without him making a comparison of whatever it is he's describing is like, or a simile is like whatever else. And so I peppered my manuscript with trying to do that. And apparently I'm not nearly as effective because that second round of editing, the line editor excised almost all of what I thought were my beautiful metaphors from this manuscript. So I'm apparently no Stephen King. But I have spent some time, reading those folks. When I was writing the Double Cross book, which is about missionary spies, I was reading Jean le Carré kind of spy novels and thinking about the language of spycraft and trying to make sure that I understood the terms and again, trying to think about, if an audience reads spy novels and then they read my book about real spies, there's obviously massive differences, but hopefully there is some crossover. Hopefully, I can make my story as compelling as Jean le Carré, which again, I cannot make it as compelling as Jean le Carré, but that's at least the goal.
Absolutely. Are there aside from sort of trying to understand a genre that you are maybe writing relationship to, are there other writers or historians that you look to for inspiration you like to read?
I'm always impressed with Jill Lepore. Her use of words. When I was working on the introduction to my book, I pulled up the introduction to her more recent big U.S. history and just thought about, like, how do you set up a massive book like this that's going to be kind of argument driven, but also kind of synthetic? And, clearly with her success at the New Yorker, she's somebody who has figured out how to still do serious history, but to reach a larger audience. So she's another model. I remember, I guess another thing that I learned early on, and this was back working with the PBS documentary, was thinking about writing in the way that people write about stage shows with acts, and thinking about, like, if it's going to be long, if it's going to get to a point where you're really going to have to ask readers to stick with you for a long period of time, you want to kind of think about narrative arcs, ups and downs, but you also want to and have to build drama into the text. And so you don't want to do what we're trained to do in graduate school, which is to begin, your introduction in every chapter telling the reader where it's going to end, because then they really don't have to read it. But you also, if you're not going to do that, you have to compel them to want to read it, to keep them engaged, to keep some mystery, some suspense into the text. And so I've certainly tried to do that as well, to kind of tease readers about where it's going without kind of telling them what the end is going to be until I get there. So in that case, it also is just thinking about novelists and people who write fiction and in the ways that they tell dramatic stories and trying to apply that to the historical profession. And I've actually, as I finished up Chosen Land, I've been talking to editors again about the next project. And some of the editors I've been talking to have really reinforced that idea also, that you really have to keep readers curious. And if you can't keep readers curious, there's no point. You're going to lose them. And again, this is the general nonfiction readers, not the grad students who have to finish whether they want to or not.
Where do you go from here? How do you think about what you work on next after writing the history of Christianity in America?
So I'm turning 180 degrees. One of the theses of the book is that Americans believe that many Americans, not all Americans obviously, but many Americans believe that the United States is God's new chosen land. That's where the title comes from. John Rolfe described North America that way in the 1610s when he was helping settle the Virginia colony. And then Herman Melville used the term in the 1850s, and then Ronald Reagan uses it in the 1980s. And so I played with this metaphor of chosen land throughout the book. So then the question becomes, well, if you think you're God's new chosen land, if you think you're building the kingdom of God on earth, what happens when things go wrong? How do you deal with problems? And so the new book is going to be on the devil and Satan in American history. But I'm not going to write another 650-page book. And so this one's just going to focus on the 1960s to the present. And essentially what I'm thinking about it is organizing it as the long satanic panic, that the satanic panic doesn't really end in the 1980s, but goes on to the present day. And I did a op-ed for The Guardian on Peter Thiel, who's been doing these Antichrist lectures. And so thinking about the ways in which some of these issues of Satan, the devil, the Antichrist continue to be with us in ways that are really surprising and unexpected. And I certainly would have never guessed that Peter Thiel would be talking about the Antichrist if you had asked me a year ago. And again, I'm going to publish this one again with BASIC, partly because very much because I was so impressed with the editing work and the time and the care they put into Chosen Land. And I've just been so happy with the editorial team there. So it'll be another book with BASIC.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to read it. And I'm glad to have read Chosen Land. And I think that other people will enjoy it too. So I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes and to seeing what you're up to next. So Dr. Matthew Avery Sutton, thanks so much for joining me on Drafting the Past.
Thanks, Kate. This was really fun. I really appreciate it.
Thanks again to Matt for joining me and to you for listening. Find links to his books and more in the show notes at draftingthepast.com. And don't forget to go to draftingthepast.com/survey to tell me what you like about the show and what you think I could be doing better. I really appreciate your help. Until next time, remember that friends don't let friends write boring history.